Her name was Frau Troffea. On the morning of July 14th, 1518, she walked out of her half-timbered home on a narrow cobblestone street in the city of Strasbourg, and she began to dance. There was no music, there was no festival, there was no celebration, there was nothing, only her, moving in the searing July heat, her feet marking a rhythm that nobody else could hear. Her husband watched from the doorway. He begged her to stop. She did not stop. She danced through the morning and into the afternoon, into the evening, into the dark, until her body gave out entirely and she collapsed, twitching on the stones. The next morning, she got up and started again. Within a week, 30 other people had joined her. By August, the number was 400. They danced in the market square and in the alleys and against the walls of the cathedral. Their arms thrashed, their eyes were vacant. The blood pooled into their feet until it soaked through their shoes and left red marks on the stones. Some of them died. Nobody, not then, not now, not after 5 centuries of argument and analysis, has ever been able to fully explain why. Welcome back to Echoes of Darkness, where we go where the light doesn't reach. I'm glad you're here. And I want to say right from the start, this episode is different from our usual cases. There is no killer, there is no court, there is no confession, there is no verdict. There is only a medieval city in a summer of famine and fear, and 400 people who could not stop moving, and a mystery that history has never fully solved. This is the Dancing Plague of 1518, and it is one of the strangest true stories this channel has ever told.
To understand the Dancing Plague of 1518, you have to understand what Strasbourg was living through in the years before Frau Troffea walked into the street. Strasbourg was, by the standards of its time, a city of considerable wealth and prestige, a free city within the Holy Roman Empire, sitting at the intersection of trade routes, home to a cathedral that dominated the skyline for miles. But in the decade before 1518, the world had been very unkind to its people. A string of devastating harvests had left the poor of Strasbourg, and the poor were the vast majority, in conditions of acute famine. There was not enough bread. There had not been enough bread for years. People were dying of hunger in the streets. Into this hunger came disease. Smallpox moved through the tenements. Syphilis, newly arrived in Europe from the Americas and moving fast, was not yet understood and not yet treatable. People watched their neighbors develop symptoms and did not know if they were next. And over all of this hung a theological terror that is almost impossible for a modern mind to fully inhabit. These were people who believed, genuinely, completely, without a shadow of doubt, that disease and famine were the direct expressions of God's displeasure, that suffering was punishment, that if things were this bad, it was because they had done something to deserve it, and that the saints, if not properly propitiated, would visit specific, targeted curses upon the living. Saint Vitus was the patron saint of dancers and epileptics, and crucially, the saint believed to have the power to curse people with a dancing plague. To fail to honor him in the theology of 16th century Strasbourg was to invite exactly the kind of affliction that would befall the city that July. The curse was not a metaphor, it was a diagnosis. John Waller, the medical historian whose research is the most authoritative account of the 1518 events, describes the conditions in Strasbourg as extreme, even by early modern standards. He writes that the dancing plague of 1518 was a pathological expression of desperation and pious fear, that it did not come from nowhere, but from a city that had been pushed to its absolute limit and had no other language left to speak its suffering. The mind of Strasbourg in July 1518 was a field of dry grass. Frau Troffea was the spark.
We know almost nothing about Frau Troffea, and I want to be honest about that from the start, because this channel does not fill in gaps with invention. We know her name, or a version of it. Some chronicles give it as Troffea, others as Troffea. We know she lived on a narrow street in Strasbourg. We know she was married because her husband is mentioned, briefly, helplessly, watching her from the doorway. We know she began to dance on July 14, 1518. And we know that she danced for somewhere between 4 and 6 days before she was taken, exhausted and barely conscious, to the shrine of Saint Vitus at Saverne. We do not know why she started. We do not know what she felt. We do not know if she was, in those first moments, terrified or tranquil, or somewhere in a place that language cannot reach. The contemporary accounts, physician notes, cathedral sermons, city council records, 6 separate chronicles, agree on the essential facts. She danced without music. She danced without apparent joy. She danced past exhaustion, past injury, past the point where any reasonable person would have stopped. When she collapsed, she slept briefly and resumed. Her feet blistered and bled. She continued. The physician Paracelsus, who visited Strasbourg 8 years after the events and became fascinated by them, recorded the beginning of the plague in his Opus Paramirum. He describes a woman who simply began to dance and, ignoring all pleas, would not cease. His account agrees with the city council records. It started with one woman. Everything else followed from her. In the year 1518 AD, there occurred among men a remarkable and terrible disease called Saint Vitus's dance, in which men in their madness began to dance day and night until finally they fell down unconscious and succumbed to death. Physician account, 1518, cited by John Waller, A Time to Dance, A Time to Die, 2009. Within a week of Frau Troffea's first steps, 30 other people had joined her in the street. They were not imitating her, or not only imitating her. They were afflicted in the same way she was, unable to stop, unable to explain, unable to do anything but move. The city of Strasbourg began, for the first time, to pay attention and to make decisions that would make everything dramatically worse.
The spread was not gradual. It was sudden, accelerating, and, from the perspective of the people watching, inexplicable. Within a week, 30. Within a month, accounts vary between 100 and 400 people overtaken by the same compulsive, uncontrollable movement. They danced in the market square and in the side streets and in the courtyards. They danced in groups and alone. They danced with their eyes open and with their eyes closed. Some wept as they danced. Some appeared to feel nothing at all. Their physical deterioration was rapid and severe. Feet blistered, bled, became infected. Joints swelled. Hearts, pushed past their limits by days of continuous exertion in the July heat, gave out. Some dancers collapsed and did not rise. Contemporary accounts, though disputed in their specifics by modern historians, describe deaths by heart attack, stroke, and sheer exhaustion. Here, I want to pause and be precise about something, because this channel's credibility matters more than a dramatic statistic. The claim that 15 people died per day, widely repeated, including in John Waller's earlier work, is not confirmed in the original Strasbourg city records. Waller himself acknowledges this. The sources that cite specific death tolls are later accounts, not contemporaneous documents. What the contemporary records confirm is this: it happened, it was severe, it lasted 2 months, and people were seriously harmed. The exact death toll is not known. What is known, precisely, is that the city council was watching and that they made a decision that defies modern comprehension.
The civic and religious authorities of Strasbourg were confronted with something they had no framework to understand. And in the absence of understanding, they did what institutions so often do. They reached for the nearest available explanation and acted on it with complete confidence. The physicians they consulted diagnosed the affliction as the result of hot blood, an overheating of the body's natural humors, a medical concept inherited from ancient Greek medicine that held that illness was caused by imbalances in the body's fundamental fluids. The prescribed treatment was logical within this framework and entirely disastrous in practice. If the dancers had hot blood and hot blood was cured by movement, then the dancers needed to keep moving until the fever broke. The city council cleared and refurbished guild halls to give the dancers space. They hired musicians to provide accompaniment. They employed strongmen and professional dancers to keep those who were faltering on their feet.
to prevent the weakest from collapsing and being trampled. They built a stage in the public horse market and put the dancers on it, in full view of the city, for everyone to see. The decision to provide musicians was, by John Waller's analysis, one of the most consequential errors of the entire episode. By giving the dancing official sanction, by surrounding it with musicians and stages and professional support, the council transformed it from an affliction to be resisted into a spectacle to be joined. The number of dancers grew after the Guildhalls opened, not before. The religious authorities, meanwhile, reached a different but equally consequential conclusion. This was not hot blood. This was divine punishment. The dancing was St. Vitus's curse, visited upon the city for its sins. And the cure, therefore, was not medical, but spiritual. They banned public dancing. They banned immoral music. They closed the bathhouses, which were associated with licentiousness. They expelled prostitutes from the city. None of it worked. The dancing continued. The city had thrown everything it had at the problem, and the problem danced on regardless, indifferent to both medicine and theology. In September 1518, in what appears to have been an act of genuine desperation, the council changed course entirely. They organized a procession. They gathered as many of the dancers as could be collected and transported them, in wagons, because many were too weak to walk, to the shrine of St. Vitus at Saverne in the hills above the city. There, masses were said. Prayers were performed. Red shoes, traditionally associated with St. Vitus, were placed on the dancers' feet. And then, over the course of several days, the dancing stopped.
Historians, physicians, psychologists, sociologists, and mycologists have been arguing about the dancing plague of 1518 for generations. Here is where the evidence currently stands, with full honesty about what each theory can and cannot explain. Theory 1. Demonic possession. The explanation offered by contemporaries themselves, that the dancers were possessed by the devil or cursed by St. Vitus. This was not metaphor in 1518, it was a sincere, literal diagnosis. Verdict. No modern historian supports this as a physical explanation. It does, however, tell us everything about how the people of Strasbourg understood their own experience, and that understanding is part of why the plague spread. Theory 2. Ergot poisoning. Ergot is a toxic fungus that grows on rye grain, the same fungus implicated in the Salem witch trials. Its chemical compounds are structurally related to LSD. Contaminated bread could cause convulsions, hallucinations, and twitching. Verdict. John Waller and others have effectively debunked this. Ergot poisoning causes debilitating pain, gangrene, and a loss of motor control, not coordinated, rhythmic, sustained dancing. Nor would hundreds of people react identically to food poisoning. And rye was not a staple grain everywhere other choreomanic episodes occurred. Theory 3. Heretical religious sect. Sociologist Robert Bartholomew proposed that the dancers were members of fringe religious movements, dancing deliberately to attract divine favor or as a form of ecstatic worship. Verdict. Possible for some participants, but cannot account for the involuntary nature of the affliction as described in multiple independent sources, or for the evident distress of the dancers and their families. Theory 4. Mass psychogenic illness, mass hysteria. John Waller's conclusion, and the most widely accepted theory. Under conditions of extreme stress, communal belief, and social contagion, the body can produce genuine physical symptoms without any physical cause. The dancers were not faking, their suffering was real. But it originated in the mind, not the body. Verdict. This is the best available explanation, but it is not a complete one. It explains why the conditions existed for an outbreak. It does not fully explain why it took this specific form, why it began with this specific woman, or why it ended when it did. What strikes me about all four theories is not which one is right. It's that after 500 years of investigation, we still cannot say for certain. The dancing plague of 1518 remains, officially, a mystery. And there is something important in that, something this channel has always believed about the stories that stay with us longest. The ones without answers are the ones that never let go.
In September 1518, the dancing plague of Strasbourg ended. Not gradually,
not with a clear medical intervention, not with a moment that historians can point to and say, "Here, this is what cured it." The dancers were taken to the shrine of Saint Vitus. Religious ceremony was performed, and the affliction, which had consumed the city for 2 months and had resisted every attempt to stop it, simply ceased. John Waller's interpretation is that the pilgrimage to the shrine worked not because of divine intervention, but because it provided the dancers with a culturally coherent framework for recovery. In a world where the cause of suffering was understood as spiritual, a spiritual resolution gave the mind and body permission to stop. The trance, because Waller concludes that the dancers had entered a genuine dissociative state, a deep trance that allowed them to continue beyond the normal limits of physical endurance, could only be broken by something the dancers believed was powerful enough to break it. The shrine of St. Vitus was powerful enough, so the trance broke. The city council, in the aftermath, issued a comprehensive ban on dancing throughout Strasbourg, on pain of imprisonment. It also banned immoral music, closed the bathhouses for a period, and expelled certain individuals associated with licentiousness. These measures were precautionary, but they also reflect an institution trying to reassert control over something it had never understood and had badly mishandled. The 1518 outbreak was the most thoroughly documented episode of dancing mania in European history. It was also, as far as records show, the last. There would be no comparable outbreak after it. Whether this was because the conditions that produced it, the specific combination of famine, theology, and collective belief, never coalesced in quite the same way again, we cannot say.
The 1518 outbreak was not the first. It was the last and the largest of a series of choreomanic episodes that had swept through the Rhine Valley and surrounding regions between the 10th and 16th centuries. In 1374, the largest pre-1518 outbreak began in Aachen and spread through several towns along the Rhine. Thousands of people affected, dancing through the streets, entering churches uninvited, convulsing and shouting. It spread to Cologne, Metz, Strasbourg itself. Clergy performed exorcisms. The dancing eventually stopped. In 1418, another outbreak in Strasbourg. In 1428, one in Switzerland. Every outbreak that left a documented record occurred along the western edge of the Holy Roman Empire, an area Waller notes had particular cultural investment in the cult of St. Vitus, and therefore the most fertile psychological ground for this specific form of mass psychogenic illness. Mass psychogenic illness is not a relic of the medieval world. In 1962, the Tanganyika laughter epidemic saw nearly 1,000 people, beginning with 3 girls at a boarding school in Kashasha, Tanzania, experience uncontrollable laughter. It spread through villages and lasted 18 months. In 2011, a cluster of tic disorders spread through a high school in Leroy, New York. In 2012, a similar cluster appeared in Danvers, Massachusetts. The mechanism John Waller describes for 1518 Strasbourg is the same mechanism investigators found in Leroy, New York in 2011. The capacity for collective psychological contagion is not historical, it is human. The form changes with the culture. In 1518 Strasbourg, it was dancing, because dancing was the culturally available language for St. Vitus's curse. In 1962 Tanzania, it was laughter. In 2011 New York, it was tics. The content is different, the mechanism is the same. Mass psychogenic illness does not require a medieval mindset. It requires stress, a community, a shared belief system, and a trigger. Those 4 things are not historical artifacts. They are permanent features of human society.
I want to ask the question that John Waller's collaborator at National Geographic, researcher Renberg, says we too often skip past in our rush to find a cause. Not what caused this, but what does it mean that this is possible? What does it mean that human bodies can be driven by nothing more than collective belief and shared terror to dance until they bleed, to move past the point of exhaustion, past the point of injury, past the point where the conscious mind would ordinarily say, enough? What does that tell us about the relationship between what we think and what our bodies do? Waller writes that the dancers of 1518 were not performing, they were not choosing. They had entered a genuine dissociative state, a trance so deep that normal physical limits no longer applied.
The mind, pushed past its capacity to hold its suffering consciously, had found another way to express it. Through the body, through movement, through something that looked, from the outside, like a terrible, unstoppable compulsion. And here is the thing that has stayed with me since I first read about this case. The streets of Strasbourg in 1518 were full of people who were genuinely suffering, from hunger, from disease, from fear of God's punishment, from the specific, grinding, hopeless suffering of being poor and frightened in a world that offered no help and no exit. And they had no language for it, no therapy, no system, no way to say, this is what is happening to me, and I need help. So their bodies said it for them, in the only language available. That is not a medieval problem. That is a human one.
Frau Troffea's street still exists. Strasbourg is still a city, on the Franco-German border now, not in the Holy Roman Empire, but still there, still built on the same bones. The cathedral is still standing, the river still runs through the old quarter, the cobblestones are still there. We don't know what happened to her. We don't know if she recovered. We don't know if she ever danced again, by choice, by joy, at a festival or a wedding. We don't know if she understood what had happened to her, or if she spent the rest of her life trying to explain something that she had no words for. She is a name in 6 Chronicles, a woman in a street, the first. And 500 years later, we are still standing in that street with her, asking why. I think that's worth something. I think the fact that we're still asking is its own kind of answer. Not to the question of what caused the dancing plague, we may never know that, but to the question of why it matters. Because it reminds us that the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between the rational and the incomprehensible, between a Tuesday morning and the beginning of something that will consume your city for 2 months, that line is thinner than we like to think. Frau Troffea walked out of her door on a Tuesday, and everything changed. The past is always just one step outside the door.
Thank you for being here for this one. It's a different kind of darkness. No villain, no crime scene, no arrest. Just a city, a summer, and a mystery that 5 centuries haven't solved. I think those are sometimes the most haunting cases of all. If you want to go deeper, John Waller's book, A Time to Dance, A Time to Die, is the definitive account, and it reads beautifully. The Public Domain Review's essay on the dancing plague is freely available online and is one of the finest pieces of historical writing on the subject. Both are in the researcher notes in the description. Leave a comment. I want to know which theory you find most convincing and why. This comment section is going to be a good one. Next week on Echoes of Darkness, we go somewhere equally dark and equally human. The past is watching. Are you ready to look back?